Oh, what's up everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and on this episode of Coding with the Force, I'm going to show you how to use name credentials when building integrations with external applications in Apex. Alright guys, so just like with every other video I do, I first want to explain why you would care to use the thing I'm about to show you how to use. If you don't know what a name credential is, basically it allows you to kind of declaratively do your authentication with whatever external system that you're connecting to. So if you need to do OAuth to authenticate with whatever external service it is, you can basically just completely declaratively set that up within name credentials. Now, they don't work in all scenarios, but they do work in the vast majority of them in my experience. I've got several examples set up so that we can kind of go over different some common authentication flows and how they translate into name credentials, and then the different amounts of payoffs you'll get from each. So you'll see that in some scenarios you don't get a gigantic amount of payoff from using a name credential, and in other scenarios you get a pretty large payoff. So yeah, anyway, that's all they are. An easier way to set up authentication with an external system that you are wanting to integrate with. So let's just first go over a really simple one, a very common one in my opinion. You want to integrate with, say, Google Maps, right? A lot of orgs integrate with Google Maps. So how would you set up a name credential for that? Well, if you don't know, the vast majority of stuff anyway for Google Maps or for Google in general is it's not really authentication based. You have to pass a key in the URL, but it doesn't really, you don't need to set that up in a named credential. So in the scenario where you don't really need authentication, you're going to set something up like this, where you kind of name you pick a name for your name credential, you set up the URL, the base URL for whatever place whatever external service you're calling out to, and then you'll have an identity type of anonymous with no authentication, and that is pretty much it. And the amount of payoff you're going to see for this is really low, but I'll show you kind of what you get anyway from it. So I should have reverted this, but if I've built this Apex class to kind of show you how you would use an unauthenticated service, or sorry, a named credential for an unauthenticated service, and just to show you, you don't get a lot of payoff here, but there is a little bit of benefit. So for Google Maps, basically, you're just going to pass it a URL to retrieve the information that you care about. So obviously in real code you wouldn't necessarily do it the way that I'm doing it right here. You'd probably do this a lot more in a lot more dynamic way, store things in different places. This is just a simple example. So right here we're making an HTTP request, and for the endpoint you can see that we're using this callout Google Maps geocode here. And basically what this does is it says when we are making this call out to our Google Maps, when we're making this call out to Google Maps, use this name credential called Google Maps geocode, and you will see that that is the name that I made earlier for this named credential. So if we come back over here, basically the way that you reference your named credentials in your code is by doing callout, then the name of your named credential. And then you can add whatever else you want to that path. So basically what what this, at least with an unauthenticated one, is going to resolve to is just that URL that we put in there. So the URL is, https://maps.googleapis.com. Right? That's what that's ultimately going to resolve to, and because we have no authentication, nothing special is really going to happen in the background. We're just going to get that path, and then we can append whatever it is we need to it. So in this case, we needed we needed the rest of the path to the geocode portion of the Google Maps API, and we needed the address variable, so the URL variable for the address we care about, and then the way that you authenticate kind of more or less with Google Maps is by passing a key variable in the URL, and so we're adding that in here too. And then we're just, sending the request out as normal. So let me just show you, that this works, that this, odd structure here for your endpoint works. So I've got an execute anonymous script here, and we're going to run the execute anonymous Apex with editor contents command palette command. So if you don't know how to bring up the command palette in Visual Studio Code, it's Control-Shift-P, and then you'll just run this command, and it's going to go on ahead and call out and do that. And you can see that this did successfully call out and bring back the information that I cared about, right? Which is cool. Then you can make a wrapper class, all that stuff with the data and deal with it, which I'm not going to get into in this. There will be a different video for, how to do integrations in ways that aren't horrible. But anyway, so that's, we can see that that's working. And honestly, if you didn't use a named credential here, you're not going to see a giant benefit in the code. The code is literally still going to be the exact same amount of code here. But if we revert back to what I had earlier here, which was just the URL, and if we save this and then we run the same Apex or anonymous Apex script, I'll show you the one thing that does change. So if we run the anonymous Apex again, we'll see that this time it failed to run. Technically the exact same thing is happening, but it failed to run because this is now an unauthorized endpoint. So to fix that situation, we have to go to Setup, Security, Remote, Settings, and add this URL here. So if we wanted this to work, we'd have to grab this URL that we originally had put in our name credential and instead create a remote site setting for it over here. So either way, you've got to make a Salesforce record. It's just, would you rather put it in remote sites, or would you rather it stay with everything else that you're theoretically authenticating with, especially when you do OAuth and stuff, which we'll see here in a minute. You do save code. So my personal suggestion, and I think a lot of people's preferences that do use named credentials, is that if you're doing an authentication with an external system, put it in the named credential as opposed to the remote site settings. And that's just to remain consistent with everything, to know where all of your connections kind of stem from, etc. So, all right. Now that we've gone over that one, the very, the least beneficial use case, let me go over the next, the next highest level of benefit, I suppose. So, say you need to do a username and password configuration for something. So I've got this GitHub authorization flow, and it uses password authentication as opposed to OAuth, right? And in this one, we're actually going to see that there is a little bit of code benefit here. So if we come in here, basically what this name credential ends up being is a named principal password authentication. And you don't, I just want to point out, you don't actually have to have these two checkboxes checked. I'll explain briefly what these do later. But for password authentication, you will see a small benefit. But basically what this allows you to do is connect without using an authorization header for a username and password setup. Again, very simple here. It's the same kind of setup as the one that we just looked at, but in this case we are actually doing password authentication. So let me show you the differences between, you know, if you used a name credential here with password authentication as opposed to just writing it out in the code. If I can find the right class. So if we look at this class that I set up here earlier so that I could demo this to you all, pretty easy, and hopefully just kind of talk through all this stuff. You can see that, oh man, zooming in really made that challenging there. You can see that, you know, basically we're doing the same thing that we just saw. We're setting up that call out with the GitHub authorization flow, which is an old name for this, I think. No, actually that's still the right one. Good. Okay. So we're doing we're authenticating using that GitHub authorization flow named credential. And so basically what that is allowing us to do is Salesforce is going to automatically do that authentication for you when you do the call out. So I'll show you what I mean here. If I switch over to this one, which is the same thing, it's the same thing as this GitHub pass token call out, but it doesn't use a named credential. So in this variety here, you can see that there is one extra step that you have to do where you do a set header for the HTTP request that you're about to send out. You can see back here, these are literally the same callouts. You don't actually have to do that authorization request, or you don't have to set that authorization parameter in your header if you use a named credential here. So you save a little bit of code. You don't have to store your token either in the code or in a custom metadata object that you create, which would obviously be a waste, which we'll see here in a second. I know a lot of people will put these authorization tokens into custom metadata and then reference them into the code. Well, if you just have used a named credential, you wouldn't have had to do that. You wouldn't have this extra custom metadata, well, custom metadata type, not object, just laying out around there. And instead you just have one named credential record to handle this for you. So pretty cool that it is able to, you know, do that for us. And I will show you that here in just a second, that this indeed works just the same as this no credential call out here. So we'll bring that up and we'll do and execute anonymous on this script. So the script is just calling the it's just calling that GitHub pass token callout class to make a call out to, you know, find all my GitHub repos. And it did indeed find all of them, as you can see from this wonderful, you know, JSON object that it returned. Everything's there, and we actually got it returned to us. Cool. And we didn't, you know, we didn't have to do that authorization header anywhere in this code. So we saved, in this case, a line of code, potentially a custom metadata object if you were going to store your credentials there. and you saved a remote site setting, because you would have to create a remote site setting for this as well, just like with the other example that I showed you earlier. So you saved yourself a lot more in this one, theoretically. I'll show you that this one does indeed return the exact same thing. If we change this over here to that one, and we do the execute anonymous again, it failed to run, and it failed to run because we have an unauthorized endpoint again. But if I had put that endpoint into the remote site settings, we would see that we get the exact same thing returned. So you can see already that you're getting some benefit here, right? You created literally one record in Salesforce under name credentials. You didn't create a remote site setting. You didn't create a custom metadata object to hold your authentication parameters, your username and password. You didn't have to query for that username and password in your code, and you saved yourself at least one line of code here, potentially more if you had to query for a custom metadata type. Cool. So you can already see, depending, even with this relatively simple example, that you would be saving quite a bit potentially. Now, here's where it gets really good, and I'm sorry I've taken this long to get to it, but I kind of wanted to show you the steps here. If you're using OAuth, you are going to save a lot of time and effort here if you use named credentials. I don't know if anybody's tried to do OAuth with GitHub here before, but it gets it gets a little complicated. I'm not going to say it's like insanely difficult or anything, because it's not, but it's considerably easier if you use a named credential than it is if you go and write the code that you need to write to get this done. So let me just kind of show you how an OAuth, at least in this scenario, every scenario will be slightly different. You're not going to have, your OAuth scenario is not going to look identical to the one that I'm showing you necessarily, but it will be pretty close. The core things that I'm going to show you are pretty close. And if you take the time to figure out how to use a named credential, it's going to save you a lot of time and effort. And then the next time you use a named credential for something, it's going to, be much easier. So let me show you how to set this up. So if you want an OAuth connection made using a named credential, you're going to set up the same things as everything else. You need to give it a label. You need to give it a base URL for the external service that you're going to connect to. In our case, that's api.github.com. And the identity type will be named principal, and then you'll have an authentication protocol of OAuth 2.0, because that's what we care about at this point. You'll find that the vast majority of things that you connect to are probably going to use OAuth. At least that has been my experience, unless you're doing a publicly accessible API like Google Maps or something. A great number of other services, typically almost everything is moving towards OAuth, so this is the most frequently utilized authentication method out there right now. So there's a couple of unique things that I typically do for, two things that you have to do, or I typically always do for your OAuth named credential setup. Number one, you have to create an authentication provider, which I'm going to show you in just a second what that is. You will typically always want this checkbox checked to start the authentication flow on save. It's not checked by default, but basically what this is going to do is it's going to bring you back an OAuth token, and it's going to store that for you so that you have access to it. So as soon as you save this, it's going to do the authentication flow in the background, or actually it's just going to straight up do it. The first time you do it, it's going to take you to your OAuth authentication page, and you'll see that happen. And then the other thing that I typically end up doing is I allow merge fields in the HTTP header and in the body. These two checkboxes are going to differ based on your actual needs, but basically what this allows you to do is with name credentials, there are these nice merge fields that allow you to pull in, like the client ID or the client secret or other things that you may need in your to pass in your headers or the body of your request. I often check these because in a lot of scenarios I actually need those merge fields in one way or another. You might find in a lot of your OAuth that you don't need these, so these are more optional fields down here, but just so you know, there are a handful of useful named credential merge fields that you can leverage. So that way, the name credential becomes a lot more flexible because there's a lot of scenarios where you need to actually grab, say your OAuth token that you received and pass it in the header or something, right? So just so you know that these exist, they do allow your name credential to be a lot more flexible and for you to get the individual fields that you would almost, if you're going to care about a field, these are basically the only ones that you'd care about are the merge fields that they give you access to here. Okay, so let's go over, now that we've kind of gone over what these checkboxes do. I know that's at a high level, but hopefully that kind of explains them. Let's go over this authentication provider and how you set that up. So if you didn't know, over here in setup you can do auth provider. Authentication. Where are you? I'm just going to type in auth. There it is. I guess I needed a period. So there's an auth provider area of setup, and basically what you do here is you create a new authentication provider, and that allows you to do OAuth with these different places that you need to authenticate with, these different external services that you need to authenticate with. So I'll briefly go over the GitHub one that I've set up, and then I'll show you the other options that you have and kind of go over a few of them because it's important that you know a handful of things. So for this, you can see basically what I've done here is I've selected my provider type as GitHub. Salesforce allows you to select from a few very popular provider types. GitHub is one of them for your authentication provider. And then you put in your client key and your client secret. Then you also have the the authorization endpoint for GitHub. That is this URL here that you see. And you also have the access token endpoint, or the token endpoint is how Salesforce references it, and that is this URL for GitHub as well. And then I've also defined some scopes here. So for instance, if you only want your users to be able to access different areas of whatever external system that you're calling out to, and you don't want this to be used in ways that you didn't intend for it to be used, you can define the scopes, or basically the things that your users can actually access that are connecting to these endpoints. I know that typically you're connecting through code, but you never know who's gonna try to be malicious and do crazy things, and the default scopes kind of helps, I suppose, narrow that down and reduce that risk even more by defining what you are able to access when you are making these callouts. So all the rest of these fields are optional. You're typically going to check this include customer secret and API response. You're normally going to need this checked. In some scenarios you don't, but that being said, everything is different, depending on what you're connecting or what authentication provider you're connecting to. Different settings will need to potentially be set up. So that being said, let me go over in a little more generic detail the authorization providers. I just want to go over a handful of things. I don't want to dive into this too much because it can get pretty technical, and it really deserves its own video. But for the authentication providers, Salesforce gives you a number of popular provider types just by default. So you've got Apple, Facebook, GitHub, Google, etc., etc., etc. The other thing that's important here, though, is that they have OpenID Connect, and OpenID Connect will basically opens it up to anything else really that's not a popular provider. So if you want to connect to something that's maybe even an internal system through OAuth, OpenID Connect is probably what you're going to be using here to make those connections. So just so you know, even though there's a whole bunch of popular providers here, OpenID Connect kind of opens that up to more things so that you're not just limited to authenticating with Facebook or Google or GitHub or whatever. So that's the main thing I wanted to point out. There will be a different video for authentication for providers, and there will be a more in-depth video for authentication in general, but that's not really what this is about. So you do have to set up an authentication provider, right? And set up all the things that are relevant for that particular service that you're authenticating with. But once you've done that and you've got your named credential all set up, what you can do is come over here. I don't know why I'm saying that. It reminds me of Scorpion and Mortal Kombat. Good. Very off topic at this point. What you can do is create an Apex class to make this call out, and it's really simple, right? I'm not calling to those other endpoints that we saw in the authentication provider, right? So we saw that this authentication provider record, we've got to call out to this authorized endpoint, this access token endpoint, and Salesforce, through the use of a named credential, is doing all of that for us. We don't have to do all of that here in the code. Otherwise, you'd be making not one request here in your code, but you'd be making 3 separate requests. And in each request, you would have to, for the first one, you have to grab a code from a URL. In the second one, you have to grab an access token from a JSON object. And then for the third one, we'd be making this call out, the one that we're doing right now, that takes that access token, passes it in the header, which we're also not doing here. As you can see, there's no authorization set header here. So you'd normally see a set header of authorization. We're not doing any of that. So that's, I can't even estimate the amount of code in all the variety of situations you could see yourself in. I would say on the low end, you're bare minimum saving 50 lines of code. I don't know. Maybe even less than that in some scenarios, but we'll just say a safe estimate is you're saving 50 lines of code. And that's just a whole bunch of stuff you don't have to care about. And on top of that, you're also saving, again, custom metadata, a remote site setting record, etc. So you're saving a ton here by using a named credential for OAuth. And I'll just show you that this works. I didn't write the code, the code for this, because for GitHub specifically, it's actually, I don't. I've done this once. I don't have the code for it anymore. I left that with the client that I did the work for, and unfortunately, I can say that several years ago when I did this, I didn't use name credentials, and it was a whole lot more of a pain, I can tell you that. So here we've got this GitHub OAuth call GitHub, and I'm just going to execute this anonymous Apex script again, and we can see that it ran successfully, and it did grab all of my all the information that I cared about at all the repos. So best practices for developing on the Salesforce platform, which is really a name I ought to change because I don't particularly like the name best practices. I don't think there's anything that is best. There's just maybe a little better. So anyway, I'm not going to write out all of this, the code that would be needed to do this without a named credential. What I would say is, if you don't think that you're saving a lot of code here, attempt this once without a named credential, and you're going to see just how much code that you're saving by taking the time to figure out how to use a named credential and store it. It's going to save you so much time in the long run by figuring out how these things work and figuring out how to leverage them for the next external service that you want to connect to. But that being said, I'll put a link in the video to a normal connection with GitHub using OAuth in Java, because there's one that I saved from a long time ago, or a while back anyway. And you can see how much more involved it is as opposed to this method, which is not very involved at all, right? So I know that this has been a relatively long video, longer than the videos that I typically make anyway, at least most of the time. And I've said way too many times, I'm pretty sure. But hopefully this has helped somebody out there, and hopefully this has made name credentials less confusing. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. If you're confused about how to use name credentials in your particular scenario, please feel free to ask me. I'm happy to help. If you liked this video, I make a new Salesforce video at least once a week, and yeah, please subscribe. If you have ideas for the next video, let me know, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.